Paul's summons to messianic life. Insurrections, critical studies in religion, politics, and culture. Slavoj Zizek, Clayton Crockett, Creston Davis, Jeffrey W. Robbins, editors. The intersection of religion, politics, and culture is one of the most discussed areas in theory today. It also has the deepest and most wide-ranging impact on the world. Insurrections, critical studies in religion, politics, and culture will bring the tools of philosophy and critical theory to the political implications of the religious turn. The series will address a range of religious traditions and political viewpoints in the United States, Europe, and other parts of the world. Without advocating any specific religious or theological stance, the series aims nonetheless to be faithful to the radical emancipatory potential of religion. Preface. If the impression does not deceive, Paul's letters have acquired a new legibility in recent years. This is the case not only with respect to accessible writings, such as 1 Thessalonians and 1 Corinthians, letters determined by concrete situations, but also with respect to Paul's last and most visionary composition, the Epistle to the Romans. That this is so is due not merely to advances in knowledge of the historical context, though these have been considerable, nor to the overcoming of anachronistic frameworks of interpretation imposed during the Reformation, though the new perspectives have been salutary, but to something deeper, something historic, something essential to the crisis of our time, of which Karl Barth already had the intuition. From somewhere, a flash of light has made the characters of Paul's ancient text legible, and is stirring hope. The index of this phenomenon is the sudden preoccupation of a group of philosophers, Jacob Taubes, Alain Badiou, Giorgio Agamben, Slavoj Zizek, Kenneth Reinhard, Eric Santner, none of them Christian, several of them avowed Marxists, with the letters of Paul. Why should secular, indeed irreligious philosophers turn to the Apostle Paul and find in him the embodiment of the figure of the militant, a truer type than the figure of Lenin installed in the imagination of philosophers at the beginning of the 20th century? Merely to raise this question is to penetrate to the core of the phenomenon of Paul's present legibility. For these philosophers may be said to be acutely aware of the threat that hangs over the present moment, a danger described variously as a state of exception or biopolitics by Agamben and as the absolute sovereignty of capital's empty universality by Badiou, but a danger upon whose dehumanizing consequences all are agreed. In a world where political processes are increasingly controlled by capital, and where social relations are mediated by images, there is the danger not only that the masses may become, as they always have become, the tools of the ruling class, but now, more seriously, that human sociality may be alienated from itself by the global triumph of a digital machine capable of manipulating perception and controlling memory through the invincible logic of the integer. The supreme danger is that the residue of the other, the neighbor, upon whose alien reality my own humanity depends, may be fully metabolized by the perpetual motion of capital, which homogenizes all identities. Or, to speak in the language of our tradition, the danger now exists that the Judeo-Christian sense of social obligation embodied in the commandment "You shall love your neighbor as yourself" will be entirely swept away by a resurgence of that structured inequality which was the basis of the political economy of the Roman Empire. It is the sense of Paul as a contemporary to a perilous moment for humanity that has drawn the philosophers to the apostle and has given his texts their new legibility. Paul wrote his epistle to the Romans at the midnight of the 1st century, the reign of Nero. The sole sovereignty of the successors of Augustus was an ongoing state of exception in which politics perished, a new structure of power constituted and reconstituted by the imposition of various degrees of dependent subjecthood and, in the last instance, by terror. The wealth of the emperor and his syndicate depended upon the vigorous exploitation of the resources of the provinces and upon the enslavement of a significant portion of the population, the latter institution maintained by the cruelty of crucifixion. By the age of Nero, spectacle had become an all-encompassing feature of social experience, which not only blurred the boundary between the real and the representational, but threatened the expropriation of human sociality itself. The mass burials uncovered by archaeological excavations outside the gates of Rome are a grisly testimonial to the dehumanization of precisely that segment of the population from which Paul and other evangelists recruited the members of their messianic assemblies. The philosophers who, in a moment of danger, seek to link their present to the apostles' past have glimpsed in Paul's messianic faith a spark of hope. For anyone familiar with this literature and its antecedents, it will already be clear that the hermeneutic which governs the new philosophical readings of Paul is that which Walter Benjamin gave to historical materialists in On the Concept of History and in some notes in his unfinished Arcades project. In contrast to the method of historicism, which seeks, by forgetting the subsequent course of history, to lay hold of the eternal meaning of a work, and in contrast to the popular, liberal assumption that a work is susceptible of a variety of legitimate interpretations, depending upon the interpreter's perspective, Benjamin proposed that a text such as Romans contains a temporal index that connects it to a specific epoch, and that it comes forth to full legibility only for a person who is singled out by history at a moment of danger, a perilous moment like the one in which the work was composed. Whether Benjamin's hermeneutical principle applies to all literature, to every text, I am incompetent to judge. But this hermeneutic seems particularly appropriate to crisis literature, to texts such as Romans and the Gospel of Mark or the Apocalypse of John, works composed, as Benjamin would have it, in the immediate messianic intensity of the heart. The new philosophical interpreters of Paul merit our attention because they have exposed themselves to the danger that threatens our world. In that respect, they are the readers for which Romans has been waiting. Benjamin's hermeneutic will be presupposed in what follows. Only, of the two moments that this hermeneutic seeks to hold together in constellation, I will place the greater emphasis upon the earlier one, Paul's own kairos. This is not only because I am a New Testament historian by training, but also, and more importantly, because for all the light that has recently been cast upon Paul's letters, it does not seem to me that Paul's kairos has been fully disclosed. Therefore, the image that should be formed when the historian grasps the connection between the perilous moment in which he reads and the one in which Paul wrote remains obscure, has not fully crystallized. And thus, there has not been an explosion of consciousness as a result of the new encounter with Paul, no now of recognizability, as Benjamin terms it, or, to employ Paul's own phrase, no renewal of the mind, Rom 12:2. I shall argue below that the defect in current philosophical interpretations of Paul is a consequence, in large measure, of the philosopher's commitment to the project of knowledge, a commitment that Paul did not share, and that, in fact, he vigorously opposed. 1 Cor 1:18-25. In particular, Paul did not believe that the kairos depended upon the self-presence of consciousness. Nor did Paul share the philosopher's passion for universal truth. Paul's truth, to the extent that he speaks of one, is a singularity. Crucially, the temporality that Paul posits as a creation of the messianic event stands opposed to every philosophical teleology. There is no room in Paul's now-time for the future. I shall argue that Paul's concept of the now-time can only be understood when it is located in proximity to Jesus's proclamation of the nearness of the kingdom of God. Finally, the political activity that Paul's faith demands has nothing of the passivity to which the philosopher seems resigned. Paul's fighting spirit seeks to hasten the awakening. The most certain evidence that Paul's kairos has not yet been fully disclosed is the absence of two crucial paragraphs of Romans from the discussions of the philosophers. The absence is most notable and most puzzling in Agamben's commentary and in Badiou's monograph. Instead of Romans 13:8-14, the attention of philosophers has focused upon an earlier and provisional formulation of Paul's understanding of messianic time in 1 Corinthians 7:29-31. What is it that blocks access to Paul's most mature and intense formulation of the law of messianic life and the eschatological faith that empowers that life in Romans 13:8-14? Two obstacles may be clearly identified. First, the pernicious text of Romans 13:1-7, which, according to the traditional interpretation put forth by commentators, enjoins submission to the governing authorities instituted by God. With good reason, some interpreters question whether Romans 13:1-7 is authentically Pauline, and not rather a piece of Hellenistic Jewish paraenesis interpolated at a later date. I will devote scant attention to this problematic text here, choosing rather to expend my constructive energies upon the restoration of the neglected paragraphs of Romans 13:8-14 to the center of our concern. I will be content to have demonstrated that the political ethics demanded by Paul in Romans 13:8-14 is inconsistent with the traditional interpretation of Romans 13:1-7. A second obstacle is the persistence of interpreters, both philosophical and traditional, in assuming that, to the end of his life, and even in his latest epistles, Paul was waiting for the so-called second coming of Jesus. As we shall see, Paul nowhere mentions the parousia in Romans, or in any of his later epistles. Instead, Paul summons believers to an awakening by grasping the full implications of a messianic event that had already occurred. I will argue below that Paul's eschatology underwent significant development from his first epistle, 1 Thessalonians, to his last, Romans, and that this development had the character of an intensification, that is, the future hope of Paul's early years became, in the crucible of his suffering, a present reality. This is a crucial contribution to my dialogue with the philosophers, since even the best of Paul's philosophical interpreters are captive to the traditional notion that Paul decomposed the messianic event into 2 times resurrection and parousia, and that Paul continued to await the second coming of Jesus at the end of time. I will argue below that those who are waiting for something to happen, even those who are waiting for the inevitable to happen, remain enthralled by the future, and so never enter with Paul into the today of salvation. In sum, the traditional interpretation of Romans 13:1-7 as a Pauline preachment of submission to the authorities, and the conventional assumption that Paul's eschatology was static and that he continued to await the second coming are the 2 rams whose blood must fill the trench, if the spirit of Paul's most intense formulation of the demands and conditions of messianic life in Romans 13:8-14 is to rise and speak to us. I would suggest that, if either of these doctrines is sacrosanct, the reader should lay aside my little book and read no further. Finally, it is my impression that Christians and non-Christians have, for the most part, despaired of our capacity for neighbor love, especially if the neighbor embodies ethnic or religious differences or is an avowed enemy. So strongly are the populace and its perceptions molded by the hands of capital and its political servants. In this midnight of the 21st century, we must hold fast to the memory of Paul, who did not despair of glimpsing in the little groups of mainly oppressed persons who had joined his messianic assemblies the vanguard of the sons and daughters of God, who would awaken and take responsibility for the redemption of the world. Rom 8:19. 1. Neighbor, A. In Romans 13, Paul enlarges upon a conviction that he first expressed some years earlier in his epistle to the Galatians, 5:14. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. 1 Leviticus 19:18, Septuagint. From the heart of the Holiness Code 2 is cited as warrant for the one obligation that remains for members of the Messianic community: owe no one anything, except to love one another, for the one who loves the other has fulfilled the law. Rom 13:8. Epitomizing the Torah in a demi-decalogue, Rom 13:9, 3. Paul asserts that the word of Leviticus 19:18 summarizes, or recapitulates, all the commandments: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Thus, Paul is able to conclude that love is the fulfillment of the law. Rom 13:10. As is well known, such summaries of the whole law are found elsewhere in Jewish tradition. The Golden Rule is attributed to Rabbi Hillel as the essence of the Torah. For a generation after Paul, Rabbi Akiba cited Leviticus 19:18 as the principle that sums up and contains the whole of the Torah. 5 But the frequent citation of Leviticus 19:18 in early Christian literature 6 makes it likely that Paul took the quotation from the tradition of Jesus' sayings, as attested by Mark 12:31 and parallels. 7. The conclusion that Paul is following a tradition established by Jesus gives point to the assertion of Jacob Taubes in his exposition of Paul's political theology, Paul's designation of neighbor love as the fulfillment of the law represents a radical reduction within the primordial core of the Jesus tradition. Point 8 As Taubes observes, Paul cannot have failed to know that Jesus taught the dual commandment. Point 9 Asked by a lawyer which commandment in the law is the greatest, Jesus answered, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And the second is like it, You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Matt 22:35, 40. Point 10 Paul's omission of the command to love God from his summary of the whole law in Romans 13 cannot, Taubes argued, be accidental, given its centrality in the Jesus tradition, but reflects Paul's conviction that this burden has been lifted from the shoulders of the new people of God, in consequence of the messianic event. Point 11 How this came about Paul explains in Romans 5, through divine kenosis. Point 12 This is Paul's interpretation of the death of the Messiah for the weak, the ungodly, and enemies. God commends his love toward us in that while we were still sinners the Messiah died for us, Rom 5:8, cf Rom 5:5, 11. Point 13 For those who have experienced the messianic klesis, calling, there is now only one imperative, to love the neighbor as oneself, that is, to love the nearest embodiment of the ones for whom the Messiah died, following the kenotic movement of divine love. Thus, the divine kenosis has sublated the first commandment. To his credit, Taubes did not shy away from the psychotheological implications of Paul's sublation of the commandment to love God. By way of a series of lengthy citations from Freud's Moses and Monotheism, Taubes reprises Freud's version of the history of religion. Judaism had been a religion of the Father, Christianity became a religion of the Son. The old God the Father fell back behind Christ, Christ, the Son, took his place. 14 Taubes comments, this is also a contribution to the problem of the dual commandment and its radicalization in the love command, the focus on the Son, on the human being, the Father is no longer included. 15 For Taubes, the assertion that God the Father has been dethroned is not an ontological claim, but a religious way of speaking about a psychological development. Paul's sublation of the commandment to love God with all your heart and soul and might lifted the burden of guilt imposed by paternal law. As Paul's spiritual descendant, 16 Freud, so to speak, enters into the role of Paul and tries to realize Paul's theological vision by a new therapeutic method. Point 17 Freud continues Paul's work by striving to liberate us from the burden imposed by the obscenely cruel paternal agency that we harbor within ourselves. 18. Now, ironically, the sublation that, according to Taubes, was intended to transport Paul's readers beyond all superego inculpation, so that they might freely obligate themselves to mutual love, has the consequence of making the command to love the neighbor more difficult to fulfill, because it removes the force of the divine mandate. The importance of the divine mandate is inscribed in the tripartite structure of Leviticus 19:18. First, the prohibition you shall not take revenge or bear a grudge against any of your people, then, the remedy you shall love your neighbor as yourself, finally, the rationale I am the Lord, Septuagint. Point 19 Without the divine mandate, it is scarcely possible to imagine that one could undertake something so unreasonable and difficult as loving the neighbor as oneself. It is the difficulty of neighbor love apart from the divine mandate that Kenneth Reinhard, Eric Santner, and Slavoj Zizek contemplate in their 3 inquiries into political theology as the legacy of Jacob Taubes. Point 20 The insuperable difficulty of the biblical injunction is vividly evoked in the introduction by way of the frighteningly realistic assessment of Freud in Civilization and its discontents. Let us adopt a naive attitude towards it, Freud proposes, as though we were hearing it for the first time. We shall then be unable to suppress a feeling of surprise and bewilderment. Why would we do it? What good will it do us? But, above all, how shall we achieve it? How can it be possible? 21 The commandment seems more unreasonable when the neighbor is a stranger, if he is a stranger to me, and if he cannot attract me by any worth of his own that he may have acquired for my emotional life, it will be hard for me to love him. Indeed, I should be wrong to do so, for my love is valued by my own people as a sign of my preferring them, and it is an injustice to them, if I put a stranger on a par with them. 22. But if the neighbor happens to be an enemy, then the biblical injunction seems positively absurd. I must confess that he has more claim to my hostility and even my hatred. If it will do him any good, he has no hesitation in injuring me. Indeed, he thinks nothing of jeering at me, insulting me, slandering me, and showing his superior power. 23. Freud concludes his reflections on the difficulty of neighbor love by confronting the persistence in human beings of a fundamental inclination toward aggression, a primal mutual hostility. Freud observes that the neighbor is for us too often only a potential source of cheap labor, someone to be tricked or exploited, a sexual object, someone who tempts us to satisfy our aggressiveness on him, to exploit his capacity for work without compensation, to use him or her sexually without consent, to seize his possessions, to humiliate him, to cause him pain, to torture, and to kill him. Homo homini lupus. 24. Reinhard, Santner, and Zizek struggle mightily to discover resources for rethinking the biblical injunction to love the neighbor in a world where the divine throne is vacant. Reinhard takes up Lacan's proposal of an alternative logic for sexuation, not as a static situation, but as an event, an encounter involving a choice that is retroactively named either man or woman. 25. The passage of the human through an indiscernible zone that Lacan called the not all in the process of sexuation encourages Reinhard to seek for an analogous path beyond the friend/enemy dichotomy of politics. Reinhard finds the opening to this path in the figure of the neighbor, who emerges beyond the boundary of politics in the generic field of humanity. 26. But in order to operationalize the decision to love the neighbor as oneself, Reinhard has recourse to Lacan's argument that a third love is necessary, the love of God, which is the model of symbolic love, the love of the Father that sustains the symbolic order, even for those who are not believers. 27. Hence, even the Lacanian subject loves the neighbor only by means of the love of God. 28. In the end, Reinhard escapes from the difficulty of Paul's sublation of the love of God by reverting to a psychoanalytic version of the dual commandment. Santner endeavors to remain faithful to the commandment of neighbor love in an era when historical materialism sets the parameters of discourse. 29. Santner combines the Lacanian theory of the constitution of the subject with Franz Rosenzweig's attempt to recover an experience of the miraculous in everyday life. Rehearsing the account of the primal scene that gives rise to unconscious formations in the infant subject by Jean Laplanche, a student of Lacan, Santner posits that the excess of parental desire which cannot be metabolized by the child through symbolization sinks into the unconscious as residues. 30. These residues of the desire of the other constitute an internal alienness, maintained, held in place, by external alienness. 31. A miracle for Santner would represent the event of a genuine break in the fateful enchainment of unconscious transmissions, an opening of the subject toward the inner alienness of the other. 32. Santner grasps that the biblical commandment to love the neighbor directs our minds, indeed our entire being, toward that which is most thing-like about the other. 33. But how can a genuine exodus occur from the deep patterns of enslavement to the needs of the self, so as to love the other? Santner concludes that to conceive of a kind of love that exceeds mere object cathexis is already a mode of registering the region of being we call God, and testifies to the ongoing necessity of theological thinking. 34. Thus, Santner endorses Rosenzweig's project of monotheism as a form of therapy that allows for a genuine return to the midst of life with our neighbor. 35. Rosenzweig's own experience demonstrated that the miraculous achievement of neighbor love required some form of divine support, ultimately a form of love kept alive, in turn, by a certain form of life. 36. Like Reinhard, Santner seeks to evade the difficulty of Paul's radical reduction of the dual commandment by offering a post-secular solution to the human predicament, monotheism as therapy. 37. Zizek styles his contribution to the political theology of the neighbor not as a response to the problem identified by Taubes, but as a challenge to the so-called ethical turn in contemporary thought, a turn often linked to the thought of Emmanuel Levinas. 38. Zizek targets what he takes to be the gentrification of the neighbor in the thought of Levinas, the neighbor as my mirror image, in whose human face I experience the epiphany of the transcendental other who summons me to infinite ethical responsibility. 39 Against Levinas, Zizek insists that beneath the neighbor as my semblant there always lurks the unfathomable abyss of a monstrous thing whose inhuman excess requires me to practice justice, or, as Zizek terms it, ethical violence. 40 But just as Simon Magus is a cipher for Paul in the Pseudo-Clementine Homilies 41, so Levinas is a mask for Paul in Zizek's essay. Zizek simply rejects the notion that Paul sublated the commandment to love God, insisting that it is a mistake to oppose the Christian God of love to the Jewish God of cruel justice. 42 Zizek asserts that Christianity merely assumes the Jewish contradiction between monotheistic violence and responsibility toward the other. 43 Thus Zizek hopes for the return of the Jewish repressed within Christianity, the return of the figure of Jehovah, the cruel God of vengeful blind justice. 44 Zizek quotes illustratively the last song Johnny Cash recorded before his death, in which God is depicted as a kind of political informer who comes around taking names, deciding who will be saved and who will be lost. 45 On the day of judgment to which Zizek looks forward, Christianity will once again become Judaism. 46 Abolishing the illusion that Paul reduced the dual commandment. I would like now to join this discussion about the difficulty of fidelity to the love command by returning to the origin of the problematic in Romans 13. Commentators generally recognize that the following paragraph in Romans 13:11, 14, in which Paul reminds his readers of the kairos and summons them to an awakening, provides the eschatological rationale for performing the ethic in the preceding pericope. 47 Yet, strangely, none of the philosophers who have wrestled with the implications of the Pauline reduction of the dual commandment has discussed the intensely eschatological text that follows in Romans 13:11, 14. This omission is especially surprising in the commentary on Romans by Giorgio Agamben, since Agamben recognizes that the recovery of Paul as the fundamental messianic thinker in our tradition requires, above all, an understanding of the meaning of the time that Paul defines as ho non kairos, the now time. 48 The omission is just as puzzling in the book on Paul by Alain Badiou, since Badiou has been most successful among our contemporaries in articulating in a secular idiom the meaning of the process by which a newly awakened self comes forth, in response to Paul's message of the resurrection. 49 Only old Jacob Taubes, in his Heidelberg seminar of 1987, called attention to Paul's eschatological profession of faith in Romans 13:11, 14, and the concept of the now time contained within it, as the context for understanding Paul's revolutionary confidence in the fulfillment of the love command. 50 Unfortunately, the fact that time was pressing so personally upon Taubes, because of an incurable illness, rendered impossible an exposition of his insight into the relationship between the two pericopi in Romans. 51 Taubes was obliged to content himself with a reference to 1 Corinthians 7:29, 31 as a provisional Pauline formulation of the mode of existence in the now time. 52. In this monograph, I restrict the group of philosophical interlocutors to those who have taken up the challenge of Taubes's insight into the implications of Paul's radical reduction of the dual commandment. Doubtless, I might have expanded and enriched my inquiry by engaging cultural critics such as Gayatri Spivak 53, thereby alerting those who approach Paul out of a psychoanalytic philosophical tradition to what may be missing from their conversations. The reader will eventually discover that my interpretation of Romans 13:8, 14 lies closer to Julia Kristova's reading of neighbor love through Paul and Augustine. The strangeness of the neighbor is embraced within a new, singular universality through identification with the one who died for all. 54 Nevertheless, in order to maintain focus on the issues crucial to my interpretation of Romans 13:8, 14, the neighbor, the now time, an awakening of communal consciousness, I have restricted the circle of philosophical voices to those who have struggled with the consequences of Taubes's insight into the difficulty of Paul's ethical charge to love the other, following a trajectory that reaches from Benjamin to Santner. I turn to analysis of the logic that connects these two paragraphs of Romans, first of all, as an historian and an exegete. That is to say, I will attempt to situate Paul's concept of the eschatological kairos and the awakening to which it summons in the context of first-century Judaism, seeking to discern whether Paul's thought is illuminated by apocalyptic parallels, such as Psalms of Solomon 17 and Testament of Levi 18:55, or whether the Pauline kairos is more proximate to Jesus's proclamation of the nearness of the kingdom of God. I will attempt to deepen understanding of the presupposition of Paul's summons to awakening by exploring, selectively, the literature of the Silver Age, in which consciousness, both individual and collective, is depicted as sinking ever deeper into sleep. 56 I will contrast the dialectic of awakening, as Paul understands it, with the frequent attempts by Hellenistic philosophers to rouse their contemporaries from moral lethargy. 57 I will trace Paul's experience of the messianic kairos through his earlier epistles, in order to comprehend the particularity of that stage in the process of salvation which Paul images as awakening in Romans 13:11, 14. Only then will I seek to clarify how Paul's eschatological faith enables his confidence in a community capable of obligating itself to mutual love. 2. Kairos, b. According to Paul, the possibility of executing the command to love the neighbor arises from an awareness, or recognition, of the kairos, Rom 13:11. The opening of the paragraph that supplies the eschatological rationale for the love command has presented difficulties to interpreters, because the expression of Paul's thought is so compressed and pregnant, kai tauto idotes ton karen, and this knowing the kairos, Rom 13:11a. Point 1 Commentators endeavor to ameliorate the difficulty by supplying a finite verb, such as poiet, and you should do this, knowing the kairos. 2 Others hypothesize that the expression tauto idotes is a citation formula introducing a baptismal or an agape hymn, whose title was Ho Kairos, the critical time, and whose stanzas are quoted in 13:11, 12.3. We should resist these speculative solutions and hold fast to the difficulty of the text as it stands, for this has the advantage of focusing our attention upon the integral relationship between knowledge and the kairos. 4 The extreme compression of Paul's rhetoric, which brings knowledge and the kairos into the closest proximity, suggests that the kairos is not a supramundane reality which exists out there, and arrives out of a divinely ordained future, but a temporal possibility that may be actualized in the moment when it is known, a moment that, as Paul goes on to explain, has the structure of awakening. But what is this kairos through whose strait gate one may enter into the capacity for neighbor love? And how does Paul understand it? On this point, the commentators are virtually unanimous. To quote the most recent and most authoritative commentary, the kairos mentioned here is the eschatological time that began with the sending of Christ and includes the expectation of the Messiah's return. 5 In support of this interpretation, reference is generally made to Jewish and Christian apocalyptic texts roughly contemporary with Romans. 6 Thus, in the Psalms of Solomon, which preserves the most detailed account of Jewish messianic expectation prior to Paul 7 The Lord Messiah, 1732, will gather a holy people whom he will lead in righteousness, 1726, he will judge peoples and nations in the wisdom of his righteousness, 1729, he will be compassionate to all the nations, who, reverently, stand before him, 1734, blessed are the ones born in those days, 1744. 8 In the Testament of Levi, which, in its present form, is a Christian redaction of an older Jewish document. 9 The patriarch foretells the coming of a priestly Messiah. Then the Lord will raise up a new priest to whom all the words of the Lord will be revealed. He will make a judgment of truth upon the earth for many days. And his star will rise in heaven like a king, kindling the light of knowledge as day is illumined by the sun. He will take away all darkness from under heaven, and there shall be peace in all the earth. 18:2, 4. 10 In the so-called synoptic apocalypse preserved in Mark 13:11 the disciples are told, then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. Then he will send out the angels, and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. Mark 13:26, 27. 12 In all of these texts, the scheduled fulfillment of the divine plan is located in the future. In this context, Paul's mention of the kairos in Romans 13 is taken to be a reference to the return of Christ, in accordance with the expectation of the first generation of Christian converts. Point 13. If interpreters detect any nuance of difference between Romans 13 and the texts cited above, it is only that in Romans 13:11 they sense a moving on of the eschatological clock, 14 ticking more loudly as the time of Christ's parousia approaches. But things are not so simple. There are clear indications that Paul is not referring to a future event, when he speaks of the kairos in Romans 13. As elsewhere in Romans when Paul mentions the messianic time, 3:26, 8:18, 11:5, the term kairos is qualified by the temporal marker nun, which focuses attention on the present moment as such. Now 15 in the third clause of Romans 13:11, the adverb nun is placed in emphatic position to make clear its connection to the aforementioned kairos. Point 16. Thus the critical time, kairos, of Romans 13:11 does not refer to a future judgment day in which Christians must prove themselves 17, but designates the time of the now, in cognizance of which one can fulfill the commandment to love the neighbor. Point 18. Moreover, the further temporal specification in the second clause of Romans 13:11, ora eta, the hour has come already, suggests that the kairos intrudes into the present out of the past. The combination ora eta is a colloquial expression found throughout ancient Greek 19 including Matthew 14:15, he ora eta parelthen, meaning it is now past time or the hour is now late. 20. The use of this expression indicates that the kairos has long since arrived. Finally, the point of reference for the comparative eguteron, nearer, in the last clause of Romans 13:11 locates our salvation in relationship to a past moment, when we believed, od pistias amen. Point 21. In a manner that remains to be determined, Paul evidently conceives of the kairos as a relationship between the present moment and a definite previous one. Indeed, the presence of an antecedent moment within the kairos belongs to the logic of the image of awakening that Paul employs. Something is already there to be grasped, in the flash of an awakened consciousness. Thus, those interpreters are wrong who contrast Romans 13:11, 12 with other Pauline passages, such as 2 Corinthians 5:14, 19, where it is clear that the Christ event has already occurred. Point 22. The kairos of Romans 13:11, 12 does not refer to an event of the future, whether near or far. It is the great virtue of the philosophical commentary on Romans by Giorgio Agamben to have decisively rejected the understanding of the Pauline kairos as an apocalyptic event. Point 23. Indeed, Agamben designates as the most insidious misunderstanding of the Pauline gospel that which mistakes ho non kairos for the apocalyptic end of time. 24. Agamben knows that, for Paul, the Messiah has already arrived, the messianic event has already happened. 25. Yet, Agamben is unable to completely disenthrall himself from the spell of the future. Alluding to 1 Corinthians 7:29, Agamben insists that what interests the apostle is not the last day, not the instant in which time ends, but the time that contracts itself and begins to end, the time that remains between time and its end. 26. Agamben visualizes the Pauline non-kairos as a brief span at the end of chronological time, a period that begins with Jesus's resurrection and lasts until the parousia. Point 27. Agamben is rightly concerned that the spatial character of his representation may result in a falsification of the Pauline non-kairos. Point 28. So Agamben has recourse to the concept of operational time proposed by the linguist Gustave Guillaume. 29. According to Guillaume, the human mind experiences time, but does not possess the representation of it, and must, in representing it, take recourse to constructions of a spatial order. 30. The mental operation, however quick, in which an image of time is formed is what Guillaume calls operational time. 31. Applying this concept to the Pauline non-kairos, Agamben proposes the following definition: messianic time is the time we need to make time end, the time that is left us. 32. Thus, in the end, Agamben's conception of the structure of messianic time in Paul is rather traditional. Agamben writes, Paul decomposes the messianic event into two times, resurrection and parousia, the second coming of Jesus at the end of time. Out of this issues the paradoxical tension between an already and a not yet that defines the Pauline conception of salvation. 33. If one asks why the now of the Pauline kairos never arrives for Agamben, but is perpetually deferred, two answers present themselves, one superficial, the other more philosophical. First, Agamben circumscribes the kairos within chronological time. Although Agamben allows that Honon kairos does not coincide with secular chronological time, nevertheless, he insists, it is not outside of chronological time either. 34 Agamben explains, messianic time is that part of secular time which undergoes an entirely transformative contraction. 35 What this involves, beyond images of foreshortening, such as folding or furling, is not clear. 36 But as a result of the presence of the messianic event within chronological time, the parousia is stretched, in order to make it graspable. 37 The kairos never arrives for Agamben, because it is bound to the march of the second hand, even if the hour lies so close to the Messiah's coming that it risks arriving before him. 38 Second, and more importantly, Agamben's commitment to the philosophical project of knowledge as the self-presence of consciousness infinitely defers the kairos into a series of instants in which it is, or may be, graspable. 39 Agamben's insistence that the now of the kairos is defined by the presence or proximity of a subject to itself guarantees that it can never be fully actualized, for, however great the speed of thought, it can never coincide perfectly with itself, and the self-presence of consciousness consequently always takes on the form of time. 40 Thus, for Agamben, the kairos never arrests chronos, because self-consciousness constantly posits time. 41 Agamben's persistence in a philosophical perspective in which knowledge is reality contrasts with Paul's anti-philosophical proclamation of the kairos whose knowability as awakening cannot be reduced to positive knowledge. 42 To summarize, Agamben's understanding of the Pauline non-kairos falls short of the Apostles' conception in three respects. First, kairos and chronos are not genuinely opposed to each other in Agamben's philosophical interpretation, rather, kairos is a contracted and abridged chronos. 43 In Agamben's lyrical image, the pearl embedded in the ring of chance is only a small portion of chronos, a time remaining. 44 For Paul, by contrast, the kairos arrests and suspends chronos, its now is apart from the law of time. Rom 3:21. It holds back the march of history toward judgment. Rom 3:26, it is the birth canal of a new and glorious life. Rom 8:18. Second, Agamben locates the kairos in a here and now defined by self-consciousness. 45 But the Pauline kairos cannot be reduced to self-consciousness, for Paul, only the Messiah brings the kairos that consummates history. Rom 11:5, 36. Finally, in Agamben, the kairos retains a future orientation, the presence of the kairos stretches time toward its parousia. 46 But for Paul, the kairos is a relationship between a past event and a potentiality in the present. Rom 13:11, 12. The consequence of these differences should not be underestimated. Because Agamben conceives of the kairos as a time remaining within chronos, he embraces the rabbinic apology for which the messianic world is not another world, but the secular world itself, with a slight adjustment. 47 This slight difference results from having grasped one's disjointedness with regard to chronological time. 48 Agamben's disjointedness in time seems quite different from Paul's image of awakening. Since the philosophers seem to have failed us, I propose to seek an understanding of the Pauline concept of the now time by locating Paul's usage in relation to Jesus's proclamation of the nearness of the kingdom of God. I am led in this direction by remarkable and unexpected echoes of Jesus's message in Romans 13:11, 12.49 In Romans 13:12 Paul proclaims, He hemera egiken, the day is drawn near. 50 Commentators generally recognize that the closest parallel to Paul's statement is the saying of Jesus attested both in the Gospel of Mark, 1:15, and in the sayings Gospel Q, Luke 10:9, 10 Egiken he basileatio euthia, the kingdom of God is drawn near. 51 The difference, obviously, is that Jesus speaks of the kingdom, whereas Paul refers to the day. But in the Markan summary of Jesus's proclamation, the statement about the nearness of God's kingdom is the second hemistich of a synonymous parallelism, whose first line reads, Pepleretai ho kairos, the time is fulfilled, supplying another verbal overlap with Paul. 52. Most telling is the peculiar comparative egeuteron, nearer, in Romans 13:11 describing the proximity of our salvation. The term is hapax legomenon in the New Testament and, indeed, is unique in eschatological literature. 53. Leaving no doubt that it is a Pauline echo of the language of Jesus. What would it mean to locate the Pauline kairos in proximity to Jesus's proclamation of the nearness of the kingdom of God? At first, the results for our understanding would appear to be negligible, since scholars of the historical Jesus are famously conflicted about the proper understanding of Jesus's eschatology. 54. At the beginning of the last century, Johannes Weiss and Albert Schweitzer represented the position of apocalyptic eschatology. Jesus thought that the kingdom would arrive in the immediate future. When it did not, he went to Jerusalem in order to compel the kingdom to come. 55. Ch. and his followers represent the position called realized eschatology. Jesus taught that the kingdom had already arrived, and was realizing itself in his words and deeds. 56. More recently, scholars such as John Dominic Crossan make a virtue of the seeming contradiction and seize upon the tension. The kingdom of God, they say, lives between the already and the not yet. It is the future will of God in the process of realization. The parables and aphorisms of Jesus are said to be characterized by a certain tensiveness. 57. But rather than resigning ourselves to this impasse, we should analyze more closely the summaries of Jesus's proclamation in Mark and Q, for in the reflected light of the Pauline appropriation, these summaries may disclose Jesus's understanding of the relationship between the kingdom of God and time. I suggest that it is not insignificant that the Markan summary of Jesus's proclamation takes the form of a synonymous parallelism, in which the second half-line of the verse says much the same thing as the first one, with variations. 58. Apart from the question whether this Hebraic form enhances the historical reliability of the saying. 59. The form directs our attention to the relationship that holds between the fullness of the kairos and the presence of God's reign. Translating the verb form pepleretai so as to capture the full force of the perfect passive. 60. The Markan Jesus asserts that the kairos is filled full, that is, there is no more place for chronos. Or, to use the language of time rather than space, chronos stands still and has come to a stop. The ceaseless progression of moments through homogeneous, empty time has been arrested. Time is filled with the presence of the now. Further, the form of the synonymous parallelism implies that the fullness of time coincides with the advent of God's reign. In the thought of Jesus, as attested by both Mark and Q, the presence of God's reign manifests itself in the reversal of the intolerable constraints established by human sovereignty over the world: poverty, hunger, sadness, exclusion, violence. Luke 6:20, 22.61. Thus, the coming of God's kingdom is the end of human sovereignty. 62. How are we to understand the synonymity of these statements? The kairos is filled full and the kingdom of God is come near. Here, I have recourse to the theory of enunciation developed by the linguist Émile Benveniste, not in order to clarify the thought of Jesus or Paul, but in order to expose our way of being in time as the root of our predicament. According to Benveniste, the capacity of human language to refer to itself, to its own taking place, as a pure instance of discourse, goes hand in hand with time positing, chronothesis, which is the origin of our representation of time, because Benveniste takes enunciation to be the foundation of subjectivity, the action of language in consciousness, as it seeks to coincide with itself, takes on the form of time. 63. To speak in a non-linguistic fashion, subjectivity is constituted by the continuous projection of consciousness toward self-presence. This projection creates a continuum that we experience as time. Within this continuum, the present is an empty transition. Our being in time takes the form of progression through a homogeneous continuum. 64. Jesus's proclamation of the kingdom of God blasts open our temporal continuum. Jesus's announcement that the kairos is filled full aims at the arrest of our being in time, the standstill of our ceaseless projection of ourselves. The synonymous parallelism implies that only when a messianic cessation of time occurs does God begin to reign. The reign of God is the end of our time. It is our being shot through with the reality of God's reign. The paradox is that the end of our time is not the paralysis of our will, but the revolution of our will by the will of God. 65 That is to say, the proclamation of the reign of God calls for a decision, a radical change of heart, repentance, Mark 1:15, and a new social order. And because time is filled full, the choice must be made today. And the person who makes this choice chooses at a single stroke the whole of the future. The similarity of the Jesus tradition preserved in Mark 1:15 and Q Luke 10:9, 10 with Romans 13:11, 12 suggests that Paul's concept of the non-kairos presupposes Jesus's proclamation of the kingdom of God. 66 Thus, for Paul, as for Jesus, the kairos is not an interval before the end of time, but time filled with the presence of the now. For Paul, as for Jesus, the kairos is not a transition to the future, but a present in which time stands still. For Paul, as for Jesus, the kairos cannot be deferred, but must be accepted today. Behold, now is the acceptable time, behold, now is the day of salvation. 2 Cor 6:2. Paul shares the understanding of the relationship between the kingdom of God and time attributed to Jesus in the tradition. But there is one crucial difference: whereas for Jesus the kairos is entirely present, for Paul the kairos is a relationship of the present to the past. According to Paul, the Messiah has already come, demonstrating in the now time God's righteousness toward the redemption of humanity through his death for the ungodly, Rom 3:21, 26, 5:6, 8, and inaugurating in the now time a new creation, glorious and reconciled, Rom 8:18, 25.67. It is not clear that interpreters have yet taken sufficient account of the change in eschatology signified by Paul's conviction that the Messiah has already come. 68 In Romans 13:11, 12, Paul attempts to convey the potentiality of the moment in which the past messianic event enters the present through the image of awakening. 3. Awakening, c. What is this awakening, egerthene, that describes the process by which the past and present are concentrated in the now time? I propose to investigate the process that Paul images as awakening by excavating, first of all, the antecedent stage of consciousness that Paul's description invokes, namely, sleep, hypnos. While moral lethargy and even corruption and depravity are frequently represented as sleep in ancient literature, there is a palpable density and gloominess about such images in the literature of the 1st century. C.E.2 In Seneca's Hercules Furens 3 the characters move through the desolation of everlasting night, and something worse than night, for sluggish sleep clings to the black, bedraggled foliage of the overhanging trees. 5 The air hangs motionless, and black night broods over a torpid world. 6 Seneca pictures the great throng which moves through the city streets. Some slow with age, gloomy and sated with long life, others of happier years, still able to run, maidens and youths. 7 But all are longing for sleep. 8 All around is turbid emptiness, unlovely darkness, the sullen color of night, the lethargy of a silent world, and empty clouds. 9 The sleep by which Seneca images the condition of his contemporaries is described as the languid brother of hard-hearted death. 10 From whom fearful humans gain knowledge of the long night that is to come. 11 Death inhabits the rhythms of everyday life, dawn and birdsong awaken hard toil, bestir every care. Crowds in the cities are conscious of fleeting time, and seek to hold fast the moments that will never return. 12 Among the throngs moving through the streets, each has a sorrowful sense of being buried beneath the earth. 13 A similar picture of life as a procession toward death appears in Seneca's Oedipus. Each hour a new group files on toward death, a long, sad column hastening in sequence to the shades, but the gloomy procession jams, and for the throng that seeks burial, the 7 gates spread not wide enough. The grievous rack of carnage halts, and funeral crowds funeral in unbroken line. 14 Seneca's comparisons of the crowds of the dead to the throngs of the living are instances of a phenomenon noted in several recent studies of Silver Age literature, the number of characters who seem to be dead before actually dying. 15 In this connection, we may observe that the infinitive agurthene that Paul employs in Romans 13:11 to describe the coming awakening, to be roused, awakened, is used elsewhere in the New Testament in speaking of the resurrection of the dead. 16. If we now wish to diagnose the causes, both proximate and ultimate, of this tendency in the literature of the early empire to represent consciousness as sinking ever deeper into sleep, we do not have far to look, since Seneca provides glimpses of the underlying social and political realities, and since Paul himself names the dissipative behaviors by which the trance-like state was maintained among his contemporaries. When these literary allusions are correlated with the evidence that archaeology provides, a picture emerges of the violent and dehumanizing forces by which sovereign power was constituted and reconstituted in the early empire. From these forces, flight into unconsciousness was the natural response. In Seneca's account of life in the cities, overweening hopes stalk abroad, and trembling fears 17 as examples, Seneca adduces the anxious client who haunts the haughty vestibules and the unfeeling doors of his rich patrons, 18 and the demagogue who is dazed by popular acclaim and hoisted up by the mob, more shifting than sea waves 19 these and their like are driven by the uncertainty of their fates to seek the Stygian waves of their own accord 20 Seneca's gaze does not descend to the urban poor, whose living conditions had deteriorated sharply, owing to the rapid growth of Rome's population, the inconstancy of the food supply, the lack of proper sanitation and effective medicine, and the routine nature of violence. 21 Excavations outside the Esquiline Gate of Rome in the late 19th century revealed a mass grave that had been filled with 24,000 corpses sometime in the late Republic. The dehumanizing end for thousands who had endured hard lives. 22 Nor does Seneca contemplate the fate of slaves, whose numbers had grown substantially, and who might be beaten and killed at their master's discretion. 23 Along the road to Tibur, archaeologists discovered a stone billboard advertising a torture and execution service operated by a group of funeral contractors who were open to business from private citizens and public authorities alike. There, slaves were flogged and crucified at a charge to their masters of 4 sesterces per person. 24. Poverty and violence were proximate forces. The ultimate source of the sleep that descended over the early empire was the new structure of power that emerged with Augustus and his successors. 25 The consolidation of power in the person of the emperor created degrees of dependent subjecthood, variously represented in the literature of the period as slavishness, unconsciousness, and living death. 26 Seneca was all too aware of the transgressive pride that had plunged his world into a trance-like state. Seneca's Hercules wishes to seize the highest realms and snatch the scepter from his father. 27 He seeks a path to heaven through ruin and desires to rule in an empty universe. 28 It is difficult not to see the bleak world depicted in Seneca's Hercules as anything other than a reflection of the macabre reign of Caligula. 29 Who, according to Philo, overstepped the bounds of human nature in his eagerness to be thought a god. 30 Caligula's megalomania and his unrestrained cruelty toward persons of all stations are vividly recounted by Suetonius. 31 To mention only one incident recorded by Cassius Dio, once, when there was a shortage of condemned criminals to be given to the wild beasts, Caligula ordered that a section of the crowd be seized and thrown to them instead, and to prevent the possibility of their making an outcry or uttering any reproaches, he first caused their tongues to be cut out. 32. It would be a mistake to regard such incidents as manifestations of the personal depravity and insanity of a Caligula. The phenomenon was structural. Terror was the means by which sole sovereignty was constituted and reconstituted in the Roman Empire. 33 In his residential Gesti Augustus boasts of having given gladiatorial games in which 10,000 men did battle to the death, and of having sent back 30,000 runaway slaves to their masters for punishment. 34 Cassius Dio adds that those for whom no masters could be found were publicly impaled. 35 Suetonius's account of Claudius's cruelty is hardly less chilling than his report of Caligula. At any gladiatorial show, either his own or another's, Claudius gave orders that even those who fell accidentally should be slain, in particular the net fighters, the retiarii, whose faces were not covered by helmets, so that he could watch their faces as they died. 36 Nor were such public dramatizations of the emperor's power restricted to Rome. In provincial cities such as Corinth, With its large amphitheater, 37 gladiatorial shows were closely associated with emperor worship. 38. Consciousness sought refuge in spectacle entertainments. 39. The somnambulant throng moving through the city streets in Seneca's Hercules is eager to see the spectacle in some new theater. 40. Tacitus complains, there are special vices peculiar to the city which children seem to absorb, almost in the mother's womb, a partiality for the theater, and a passion for horse racing, and gladiatorial shows. 41. In one of his letters to Lucilius, Seneca confronts the compulsion of his contemporaries to watch the sufferings of condemned criminals in the arena at Rome. 42. More than 100 years after Seneca, Tertullian offered an explanation of the psychic lure of the gladiatorial shows. They, the spectators, found comfort for death in murder. 43. But sometimes the mechanism failed to excite and distract. Seneca wrote to Lucilius that he went away from the staged execution of criminals feeling more cruel and inhuman. 44. Ordinary spectators were sucked into the violence. Seneca reports the shouts of the spectators seated around him, "Kill him," they shout, "lash him, burn him." Why does he meet the sword in so cowardly a way? Why is he so frightened to kill? Why so reluctant to die? Whip him to make him accept his wounds. 45. Sometimes the spectators turn the violence against one another, as one can see on the monument of Storax, figure 1, where a murderous brawl has broken out between ordinary people attending the Munera. 46. And even more vividly on the large fresco that decorated the peristyle of a small house in Pompeii, figure 2, which depicts a full-scale riot that occurred in the amphitheater in 59 C.E. 47. Paradoxically, the spectacles to which people fled for amusement served to alienate human sociality from itself, reinforcing imperial sovereignty over all of life. In Romans 13:13, Paul describes the dissipative behaviors by which sleep secured its hold over the multitude of his contemporaries: revelries and drinking bouts, sexual excesses and debaucheries, quarreling and jealousy, komoi kai methai, koi tai kai aselgai, eris kai zelos. 48. Noting the association of these activities with Roman dinner parties, recent interpreters take this verse as a warning against nocturnal behaviors that might trouble the Christian love feast. 49. But in my view, a more relevant context is supplied by a painted frieze in the little Capanna of Salvius at Pompeii, which depicts 4 scenes of tavern life: 2 men being offered wine by a waitress, a woman and a man kissing, 2 men arguing over dice, and 2 men fighting. 50. Captions above the characters and clues encoded in the images themselves make it possible to infer the messages that these scenes would have communicated to the non-light viewers for whom they were painted. 51. 2 men, already intoxicated, compete for the wine that the barmaid carries, eagerly stretching out their hands, figure 3. The first man exclaims, "Here, hoc," while his companion counters, "No, it's mine. Non mea est." 52. The image of the woman and the man kissing emphasizes the couple's eagerness for sexual contact, by the way in which their bodies are pressed together, figure 4. The man announces his licentious intent in the caption placed above his head, "I don't want to." With Mert Alice, nolo cum Mertali, that is, he is done with Mert Alice and wishes to initiate a new sexual relationship with the woman he is kissing. 53. In the third scene, 2 men argue over gambling, figure 5. The man holding the dice cup exclaims, "I won." Exi, the other insists, "It's not 3, it's 2, non tria duas est." The disagreement turns violent on the final panel, figure 6, where the gamblers, now standing, come to blows. The men exchange insults. The first yells, "You nobody. It was 3 for me. I was the winner." Nox iametria ecofui, the other retorts, "Look here, cocksucker, I was the winner. Ort fellator ecofui." The innkeeper intervenes, "Go outside and fight it out, itis foras rixas atis." 54. The 3 behaviors, drunkenness, licentiousness, fighting, that Paul denotes by effective use of the trope of Hendiatus 55 are vividly illustrated on the walls of the Capanna of Salvius. But while the tavern artist aimed to amuse 56, Paul exposes, in melancholy earnest, the works of darkness, ta ergitio euskitis, that must be cast off. like entangling bed coverings. 57 If his contemporaries are to awaken from sleep, Rom 13:12. To summarize, we return to Seneca's Hercules Furens, which has served so well as a cipher of sovereignty. After slaughtering his wife and children in an impious frenzy, Hercules falls asleep, his eyelids fall in slumber, and his tired neck sinks beneath his drooping head. Now his knees give way and his whole body goes crashing to the ground. He sleeps, his chest heaves with measured breathing. 58 Amphitryon prays, let him have time for rest, that deep slumber may break the force of his madness and relieve his troubled heart. 59 And the chorus addresses a prayer to sleep, with a voice that might have risen from the multitudes who endured the madness and crime of Caligula or Nero. 60 And you, O sleep, vanquisher of woes, rest of the soul, the better part of human life. Sluggish brother of cruel death. You who are peace after wanderings, haven of life. Who come alike to king and slave, hold him fast bound in heavy stupor, let slumber chain his unconquered limbs, and leave not his savage breast, until his former mind regains its course. 61 Yet, even as Hercules sleeps on the ground, violent dreams are whirling in his fierce heart. 62 A sleeping Hercules is the emblem of the world that Paul and Seneca knew. 4. Awakening, c. The moment has now come to address the crucial question, what is the nature of the experience that Paul images as awakening? At first glance, it might seem that Paul's summons to awakening has much in common with the exhortations of Hellenistic philosophers to transcend base desires and overcome moral lethargy. Such admonitions occur frequently in the literature of this period, including the Jewish wisdom tradition. 1 In the Pseudo-Platonic Cleitophon, Socrates' discourses to those who spend their energy on acquiring wealth, and who are mastered by their pleasures, are judged to be truly capable of waking us up, as it were, out of slumber. A technos hosperkatheodontas epigeirein hemas. 2 In one of his diatribes, Epictetus argues that one such as Epicurus, who supposes the good to be nothing other than pleasure, says, in effect, to his followers, off to the couch and sleep, and lead the life of a worm, of which you have judged yourself worthy, eat and drink and copulate and defecate and snore. 3 The true philosopher, by contrast, is aroused from his slumbers, egiron auton ek ton hupnon, by nature herself, whose message he is to bequeath to others, remain awake, agrupnison. 4 The sermon that concludes the Poimandres begins with the admonition, O people, earth-born men, who have given yourselves over to drunkenness and sleep and ignorance of God, be sober, cease being intoxicated, entranced by irrational sleep, Olau, Andres Kaganius, Hoimathakai hupno heodis ekdidakotes kai te agnosiatio euthia, nepsate, pausast de crapelant, thelgamanoi hupno iligo. 5 As commentators have noted, the language of these philosophical admonitions is reminiscent of Romans 13:11, 13.6. But just at the point of similarity, the difference stands forth with clarity, namely, in the means of awakening. For the philosophers, the mechanism is knowledge of the self, self-mastery, or accommodation to the will of nature. Cleitophon observes that Socrates' admonitions are based upon the premise that a man should care above all for himself, panton heota dei malista epimalisthai. 7 Cleitophon draws out the conclusion of Socrates' argument how that for every man who does not know how to make use of his soul, it is better to have his soul at rest and not to live. Hos hostis psuchi me epistatai crest high, tauto to agine hesukian te psuchi kai me zen crichton. 8 Epictetus's answer to the question of what arouses a man from slumber is unequivocal, what else but that which is the strongest thing in men nature, which draws a man to do her will, though he is reluctant and groans, ti gar aloi to pantanton en anthropois escuritaton, he fuses hecusa ap to hotspolama aconta kai stenanta. 9 Recalling that Orestes was roused from his slumbers, ek ton hupnon exigirist high, by the Furies, Epictetus exclaims. Such a powerful and invincible thing is human nature. Hutos iskuran ti kai anikton estin he fuses he anthropine. 10 Thus, self-control is good, Agathon he agratia, in accordance with the sense given by nature at birth. 11 The Gnostic evangelist of Poimandres is awakened from sleep by the mind of absolute mastery, ho tes authentias nous, 12 and instructed to hold in your mind whatever things you wish to learn, esh no so hosathalize Matthean, 13 To behold in mind the archetypal form, idas and to know to archetypon idos. 14 In answer to the question how shall I come to life again, the Gnostic is told, the man who has mind in him, let him come to know himself, hoinus anthropo anagnorisato heoten. 15 Summarizing his revelatory experience, the Gnostic confesses, for the sleep of the body became the soul's awakening, egenito gaphotio eusomatos hypnos tes fuches nepsis, and all this befell me from my mind, taudo de sunibi moilabanti apotio eunoos mau. 16 In respect to the means of awakening, the difference between Paul and his philosophical contemporaries could hardly be greater. Although the Pauline summons to awakening involves a kind of knowledge, idotes, the object of awareness is not the self, or nature, or mind, but the kairos, that is, the messianic event, Rom 13:11. Indeed, as we shall see, the actualization of the relationship between knowledge and the kairos involves, for Paul, the death of the self, by means of a process that is anti-natural, to some degree, and explicitly anti-philosophical. According to Paul, awakening is an experience wherein the past event of the Messiah's death and resurrection comes together with the present moment in the life of believers, such that salvation acquires a higher degree of actuality than it had when we first believed, Rom 13:11. Because Paul represents awakening as an increased concentration upon the messianic kairos, that is, upon an event that has already happened, and in which his Roman readers have already believed, we are justified in regarding awakening as a graduated process 17 whose initial stages may be traced in Paul's earlier epistles. 18 In Galatians 1:15, 16, Paul looks back to the moment of his calling as an apostle of Messiah Jesus, but when it pleased him, that is, God, the one who set me apart from my mother's womb and called me through his grace, to reveal his Son in me, in order that I might preach him, that is, the Messiah among the Gentiles, immediately I did not confer with flesh and blood. 19 The crucial phrase, apokalypsi tun hui and auton an emoi, has caused interpreters much consternation. 20 What kind of revelation does Paul have in mind? Evidently not a vision such as that attributed to Paul in the book of Acts. 21 When Paul speaks of visions elsewhere in his epistles, he uses forms of the verb horon, to see. 22 Paul's choice of the unusual term apokalyptine in Galatians 1:16 should be given full weight, and the verb should be translated literally, to disclose, to bring to light, to unveil. 23 The preposition an in the phrase an emoi is not a substitute for the ordinary dative, denoting the object to which something happens, so that the phrase should be translated to me. 24 Paul uses the same expression in Galatians 2:20, an emoi Christos, where there is no possibility that the preposition denotes an object. 25 Thus, the entire phrase, apokalypsi tun hui and autu an emoi, suggests something latent in Paul that was unveiled by his first encounter with the messianic event. 26 However elliptical Paul's account of his experience in Galatians 1:15, 16 may be, there is no mystery about the content of the revelation. It was the death and resurrection of the Messiah. 27 It must be said that Paul places special emphasis upon the Messiah's death, 2 Cor 5:14, Rom 5:6, 8, even focusing upon the humiliating manner of his death on the cross, 1 Cor 1:18, 2:2, Philosophy 2:8. 28 The word of the cross is the power of God to us who are being saved, Paul declares, 1 Cor 1:18. 29 Paul insists that the Messiah died for all, 2 Cor 5:14, 15, including the weak and the ungodly, Rom 5:6, and especially, judging from the majority of those who responded to this message, the Messiah died for the uneducated, the powerless, the lowborn, that is, the nothings and nobodies, 1 Cor 1:26, 28, 30. At points, Paul provides glimpses of the effect of the messianic event upon himself and others. The inner experience disclosed in such passages is paradoxical in the extreme. In 2 Corinthians 5:14, Paul formulates the substance of the messianic event in the form of a premise: one died for all, heis hyperpanton apethanon. 31 Paul represents this premise as something he has been able to discern, krin antes tauto, because the love of the Messiah grasps us, or holds us fast, he agaptio Christusunici hemas. 32 But the conclusion that one might expect from such a premise, so that all might live, or so that all might be spared death, is not what follows. Instead, Paul draws the emphatic inference, so then all died, era hoi pants apethanon. 33 It is the same when Paul speaks in the first person in Galatians 2:19, 20, whether the I, ego, is to be regarded as personal or paradigmatic. I have been crucified with the Messiah, it is no longer I who live, Christos unestaromai, zodeukti ego. 34 Finally, we may mention Romans 6:3, 4, where Paul refers to the rite of initiation into the messianic community. Do you not know that as many of us as have been baptized into Messiah Jesus were baptized into his death? E agnoid hodi, hoswa baptis theman eis Christen isoun, eis ton then aton autua baptis theman. Therefore we have shared a grave with him through baptism into death, sunit hafmanoun auto diatou baptismatos eis ton then aton. 35 We may add only that Paul's initial experience of the messianic event as a death of the self was not a one-time occurrence, but evidently accompanied him throughout his life as a servant of the Messiah. In 2 Corinthians 4:10, 11, Paul reflects, we are always carrying about in the body the death of Jesus, he necrosis tou isu. For while we live, we are always being handed over to death, eis then aton paradidometha, on account of Jesus. 36. This strange, unexpected consequence of the messianic event as Paul experienced it, namely, the death of the self, stands in striking contrast to the expectations voiced in nearly contemporary Jewish texts such as the Psalms of Solomon, where the Messiah confers upon those who belong to him wisdom, righteousness, and joy. 37 Of greater relevance to the present inquiry is the clean contradiction between Paul's account of his awakening and the ideal of self-recovery promoted by the philosophers sampled above. Indeed, Paul's approach seems to have more in common with that of the philosophical amateur Seneca, who saw death as the only way out of the nightmare of existence under Nero. 38 In his letters to Lucilius, Seneca returns repeatedly to the thought of suicide, directing his readers' attention to any tree, any vein, as the path to freedom. 39 Seneca confesses to a longing for death, little by little, in a steady weakening not without its pleasures, a peaceful annihilation I know well, having lost consciousness several times. 40 Eventually, as is well known, Seneca took this way out. 41 To return, one last time, to Seneca's Hercules, when the hero finally awakens from sleep in his right mind, and sees what he has done, his first thought is of suicide. Why I should longer stay my soul in the light of day, and linger here, there is no cause. By death must sin be healed. 42. Yet the difference between Paul and Seneca with respect to the death of the self is obvious and significant. 43 For Paul, the messianic event has partitioned the self. 44 Only a part of Paul has died. To be sure, Paul speaks of this part as if it were the whole. I no longer live, Gal. 2:20a. But in each of the passages cited above, something lives on. In 2 Corinthians 5:15 Paul explains, and he died for all, so that those who live might live no longer for themselves, hina hoizont mikidi heutwazasin, but for him who for their sake died and was raised. 45 So the part that dies is the self-seeking part, and the part that lives on has attached its being to the sacrificial death of the Messiah. Similarly, in Galatians 2:20 Paul declares, I no longer live, but there lives in me Messiah, zeida en emoi Christos, and what I now live in the flesh, I live in the faith of the Son of God, and pistes o tetou huiotou thea, who loved me and gave himself for me. So the part that dies is the part denoted by the first person pronoun, ego, the egoistical part in its totality, and the part that lives on is the messianic seed, which was latent in Paul from the beginning, Gallen 1:15, 16, 46, and has now been activated by the faithfulness of Messiah Jesus, cf. Gallen 2:16, 47, whose yes saying to the love of God was so complete that he handed over his own life. One thing is clear, the messianic partition of the self that Paul experienced is not the body/soul dualism of the philosophers, on the basis of which the philosophers practice the art of dying. 48 The Messiah who now lives in Paul lives in the flesh, Gallen 2:20, the life of Jesus that is manifested on the other side of death is manifested in our bodies. Manifested in our mortal flesh, 2 Cor 4:10, 11.49 The messianic partition of the self divides the totality of Paul's being. Paul has passed through death, held fast by the intensity of the Messiah's love, participating in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, Philosophy 3:10. Only the messianic remnant remains, lives on in hope of resurrection, Philosophy 3:11, Rom 6:4. 5. Kairos, b. We may now seek to comprehend the particularity of that stage in the process of salvation that Paul images as awakening in Romans 13:11, 14. In what way does this experience differ from the antecedent stages in the process calling, revelation, death and resurrection of the self, bearing about of the Messiah's dying and rising through the world? We may begin with clues in the text of Romans 13:11, 14.1. First, awakening is characterized by proximity, a proximity that is both spatial and temporal. Our salvation is nearer, egeuteron, than when we first believed, Rom 13:11, the day is drawn near, egikon. 2 Perhaps we can circumscribe this spatial and temporal proximity in the concept of actuality. In awakening, everything that belonged to the messianic kairos acquires a higher degree of actuality than it had in the previous instances of its existence. Second, there is an unmistakable militancy about the imagery with which Paul describes the awakened consciousness to which he summons his readers. Let us therefore cast off the works of darkness, and let us put on the armor of light. Indusamethod atahoplatio photos, Rom 13:12b. Point 3 The association of light with weapons and warfare is found in Jewish apocalyptic literature. Point 4 Anticipating the final battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, the war scroll from Qumran. Praises God, you have appointed the day of battle from ancient times. To come to the aid of truth and to destroy iniquity, to bring darkness low and to magnify light. To stand forever, and to destroy all the sons of darkness. 5 Employing similar imagery, Paul pictures the moment of awakening as a readiness for battle, conveying the inner transformation required by using the middle voice of the verb enduo gird oneself. 6. Third, it is noteworthy that all of the personal pronouns in Romans 13:11, 14, whether first or second person, are plural. The pronominal subject of the infinitive agerthane in Romans 13:11b may have been humos, you, or the somewhat less well-attested hemos, us. 7 But, in any case, it is a collective subject, and not merely an individual consciousness, which is summoned to awakening. Similarly, in Romans 13:11c, Paul speaks of our salvation, hemon he soteria, with the pronoun in the emphatic position. The verbal forms of address are also plural, whether hortatory or imperatival, apobolemetha, let us cast off, Rom 13:12c, indusametha, let us put on, Rom 13:12d, peripatismon, let us conduct ourselves, Rom 13:13, indusisth, gird yourselves, Rom 13:14a, me poiesth, do not make, Rom 13:14b. In these exhortations, commentators sense Paul's attempt to engender solidarity among members of the congregation. Point 8 Obviously, awakening was a process in the life of the individual. But the collective character of the experience is emphasized in this paragraph. Fourth, Paul focuses upon concrete behaviors that must be put aside, if awakening is to occur: drunkenness, debauchery, quarreling, Rom 13:13b. Correspondingly, he emphasizes the decency of conduct, euschemenos peripatismen, that must characterize the awakened life, Rom 13:13a, point 9. To be sure, ethical admonitions to a transformed life are found in most Pauline epistles. Distinctive here is the intensity of interest, the urgency to commence, signaled by the ingressive aorist subjunctive of peripatio, 10, and the intimacy of connection, conveyed by the mystical exhortation to put on indusis the Lord Jesus Messiah, Rom 13:14a, like a tunic. Point 11. There is, one might say, an interpenetration of the self with specific modes of conduct in 13:11-14 that gives to waking being a higher concretion. Finally, the summons to awakening as a whole suggests that the moment is probative in a final sense. The day, he hemera, that has drawn near, Agamben, is a judgment day, in which each of the antecedent stages of salvation will be put to the test. Will the process that began when we first believed, Rom 13:11c, achieve critical mass, so to speak, so that it combusts? The choice on that day is absolute: clothe yourselves in the Lord Jesus Messiah, and make no provision, pronoen me poiesth, for the flesh, toward desires, Rom 13:14. The expression pronoen poiesthai, to make provision, is an idiom of business life. Point 12. The test is this: will it be possible, on the day of awakening, to suspend the routine mechanism of self-interest, the constant projection of thought toward desire, so that existence is completely enveloped in the Messiah? Whatever insight these observations may provide into the experience of awakening described in Romans 13:11-14, they do not yet penetrate to the core of Paul's conception, which is irreducibly eschatological. The awakening to which Paul summons results, in the last instance, from a knowing or discerning, idotes, of the kairos, Rom 13:11a. In awakening, the decisive event of the past, the Messiah's advent, is brought together with the present, the now of salvation, as a potential for knowledge. But why does Paul choose the image of a suddenly emergent consciousness to convey the eschatological constellation between past and present? Or, to put it another way, how does the image of awakening in Romans 13 express Paul's mature conception of the relation of past and present in the now time? Perhaps the best prospect of finding an answer to this question lies in a comparison of the eschatology of Romans 13:11-14 with that of Paul's earliest extant letter, 1 Thessalonians. 13. In response to the concerns of the Thessalonian believers about times and seasons, 1 Thess 5:1, Paul reminded them of his teaching about the day of the Lord, 1 Thess 5:2-10. The day of the Lord, hemera kuriou, comes like a thief in the night. When they say peace and security, Irene kai asphalia, then sudden destruction comes upon them, like birth pains come upon a pregnant woman, and they shall in no way escape. But you, brothers, are not in darkness, book este enscote, so that the day should catch you like a thief, for you are all sons of light and sons of day, panskap humais huia photos este kai huia hemeras. We are not of night or of darkness, book esmen nutos adaskitas. So then let us not sleep like the others, araun me katheudo men hos hoi loipoi, but let us be alert and sober, allegregoramen kai nephomen. For those sleeping sleep at night, hoigar katheudont nutos katheudosen, and those getting drunk get drunk at night, kai hoi methuskaminoi nutos methuasin. But since we are of the day, hemais de hemeras ont, let us be sober, putting on, indusaminoi, the breastplate of faith and love, and as a helmet the hope of salvation, because God did not destine us for wrath, but to obtain salvation, soteria, through our Lord Jesus Messiah, the one who died for us, so that whether we are awake or asleep, it gregoramen it katheudomen, we might live with him. It is immediately apparent how much this passage has in common with Romans 13:11-14, not only in terms of imagery, but also in vocabulary. Point 14. In both cases, Paul speaks of day, hemera, and night, nux, of light, phos, and darkness, sketos. Both passages mention drunkenness, methuo/methu, as a paradigmatic vice. Both texts employ the verb enduo in exhortations to put on spiritual armor. In both cases, the divinely destined goal is salvation, soteria. In both places, Paul employs the formula Lord Jesus Messiah, Kurios Isis Christos. At the center of both passages stands the contrast between sleep and waking, but in this case, the vocabulary is different, and the difference is significant. In 1 Thessalonians 5:2-10, Paul uses the verbs katheudo and gregorio to speak of being asleep and remaining awake, and does not employ the vocabulary of Romans 13:11, neither the noun hupnos nor the verb egeiro.15 in Romans 13:11. By contrast, Paul does not recur to the terms katheudo or gregorio.16. The difference is not merely terminological, but conceptual. The action denoted by katheudo is lying down to sleep, lying idle, passing the night in sleep. 17 But hupnos is the state of sleep, in which one dreams, from which one wakes. 18 As a powerful and all-encompassing state. 19 Hypnos was hypostasized as a god, the son of night. 20 The twin brother of death. 21 The condition described by Gregorio is being watchful or remaining alert. 22 Thus the noun gregorses is wakefulness. 23 By contrast, egeiro marks the moment of arousal, the transition out of sleep, thus, to wake up, to awaken. 24 The crucial difference between 1 Thessalonians 5 and Romans 13 with respect to the imagery of sleeping and waking is a difference between the static and the dynamic. In 1 Thessalonians 5, Paul contrasts two conditions: on the one hand, those who are asleep in their own lives, intoxicated, the sons of night and darkness. 25 On the other hand, those who are alert and sober, the sons of light and day. 26 In abstract terms, the contrast is between consciousness and unconsciousness. But in Romans 13, Paul focuses upon the moment of transition, the instant of awakening. 27 Awakening relates to sleep in Romans 13:11 precisely in being separated from it, ex hupnuigurthane, that is, the structure of awakening is dialectical. Thus, awakening in Romans 13 is a distinctive experience, to be distinguished both from consciousness and from unconsciousness. Another, more precise difference between 1 Thessalonians 5 and Romans 13 appears in the way in which night and day are contrasted. In 1 Thessalonians 5:5-8, the contrast is static and absolute. Night and day are discrete periods, each with its own denizens. 1 Thess 5:5, each spawning its own behaviors. 1 Thess 5:7-8.28 But Romans 13:12 focuses upon the moment of turning from night to day. 29 The punctual nature of the contrast is emphasized by Paul's use of a vivid expression for the night approaching its end: Henox pro ekosin, the night is far gone. 30 The aorist of the verb prokopto suggests the time of night when especially deep darkness holds sway just before dawn. 31 Again, the image is dialectical. Day relates to night precisely at the moment of separation. I suggest that the different ways in which sleeping and waking, night and day, are imaged in 1 Thessalonians 5 and Romans 13 reflect a significant development in Paul's eschatology. 32 The eschatology of 1 Thessalonians may be characterized as primitive. Paul's consolation of the bereaved in 1 Thessalonians 4:13-18 cites an apocalyptic word of the Lord, 1 Thess 4:15-16. 33 The saying about the day of the Lord that comes like a thief in the night in 1 Thessalonians 5:2 is based upon traditional material, cf. Revelation 3:3. 34 The slogan peace and security, Irene Kai Asphalia, cited in 1 Thessalonians 5:3 has its closest parallel in Jewish literature in the Messianic Psalms of Solomon, 8:18. 35 The orientation of 1 Thessalonians is entirely toward the future. Paul reminds the Thessalonians of how they responded to his preaching. They determined to wait for the Son out of the heavens, whom he, that is, God, raised out of the dead, Jesus, the one who saves us from the coming wrath. 1 Thess 1:10. 36 Paul's consolation to the bereaved is that God will bring those who have died in the Messiah with him when he returns. 1 Thess 4:13-18. 37 Only twice in 1 Thessalonians 4:14, 5:10, does Paul speak of the death of Jesus, and that only in passing. By contrast, all of the references to the second coming, parousia, of Messiah Jesus in the authentic Pauline epistles, with one exception, 1 Corinthians 15:23, are found in 1 Thessalonians 2:19, 3:13, 4:15, 5:23, 38. A striking contrast is presented by Romans with respect to Paul's eschatology. As noted, the term parousia is missing. 39 and, indeed, there are no unambiguous references to the second coming of Jesus. 40 To be sure, Paul still speaks of a day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God, Rom 2:5-41, and looks forward to the coming glory to be revealed when the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay, Rom 8:18-21.42. But it is clear that, for the author of Romans, the messianic event has already occurred. That event is the death and resurrection of the Messiah, Rom 8:34.43. The righteousness of God has been manifested through the faith of Jesus Messiah, Rom 3:21-22. At the Kairos, the Messiah died for the ungodly, Rom 5:6.44. God demonstrates his love for us in that while we were still sinners the Messiah died for us, Rom 5:8. This righteous act of Messiah Jesus has inaugurated a new creation, Rom 5:18-19, cf 2 Cor 5:17. Henceforth, nothing will be able to separate us from the love of God in Messiah Jesus our Lord, Rom 8:39. In seeking to understand this development in Paul's eschatology, we must bear in mind the number of years that have passed between 1 Thessalonians and Romans. 1 Thessalonians is Paul's earliest extant letter, and as such the oldest writing in the New Testament. 45 According to a broad critical consensus, Romans is the last authentic Pauline epistle. 46 Depending upon which chronology of Paul's life and letters one adopts, as few as 6 or as many as 14 years separate Paul's first and last letters. 47 In any case, Paul had suffered and learned much in the intervening years. He had been imprisoned and tortured on account of Messiah Jesus, 2 Cor 11:23, 25, Philosophy 1:7, 13.48 Not surprisingly, he contemplated his own death, anticipating that his life might be poured out as a libation upon a sacrificial altar, Philosophy 2:17, imagining what it would be like to be away from the body and at home with the Lord, 2 Cor 5:8, cf Philosophy 123.49 In moments of crisis, it seems that Paul appropriated the event of the crucified Messiah more deeply as the truth of his own life, 2 Cor 4:7, 12, 12:9, 10.50 In my view, it would be a mistake to attempt to explain the development in Paul's eschatology as a rationalizing response to the specious problem of the delay of the parousia. 51 Indeed, I would argue that the mature eschatology of Romans reflects an intensification of expectation. 52 Our salvation is nearer than when we first believed, Paul declares, Rom. 13:11. By the time Paul wrote Romans, the future hope of Paul's early years had become a present reality. 53 To be grasped in a moment of awakening. We may now summarize what we have learned about the awakening to which Paul summons in Romans 13 as the culmination of Pauline eschatology. Paul urges his readers toward a moment when the full import of the messianic event will be received in the present as an actuality. In that moment, the latent messianic self that was unveiled in the calling, and that had emerged through participation in the Messiah's death and resurrection, ignites in the flash of an awakened consciousness. In that moment, the constant projection of thought toward desire is arrested, the existence of the believer is enveloped in the Messiah. The awakened self takes charge of his conduct, giving each action a higher ethical purpose. The awakened self is a militant, armed for struggle against the powers of darkness that had once enthralled him and that still hypnotize others. And the awakened self participates in a collective consciousness, bound to others by the love that led the Messiah to die for all. The community of awakened selves is the revelation of the sons of God, he apocalypsis ton huion to thea, for which the whole creation waits with eager longing, Rom 8:19.54. 6. Neighbor, How does an awakening among those who have discerned the kairos make it possible to fulfill the command to love the neighbor? Or how does the eschatological faith professed in Romans 13:11-14 empower the political ethics enjoined in Romans 13:8-10? Or, once again, how does the messianic temporality of awakened being liberate persons so that they may obligate themselves to mutual love? Again, we start from features of the text. First, the capacity to obligate oneself to mutual love arises only when all other obligations have been renounced, no one anything, medeni meden ophelit, except to love one another, 13:8a. The verb ophello denotes financial, legal, or social obligation, so, indebtedness. 1. But it would be a mistake to interpret Paul's admonition as an extension of conventional advice against incurring debts. 2. Paul's injunction is sweeping, owe nothing to anyone. The force of the injunction intensified by the use of the present imperative form of the verb. 3. The structure of obligation in the Roman world was patronage, an asymmetrical personal relationship involving reciprocal exchange. For in practice, patronage was a means of social control through the manipulation of access to scarce resources. 5. The system of obligation even extended to slaves, through the institution of peculium, property, in whatever form, assigned for use, within limits, to someone who lacked the right of property, either a slave or someone in patria potestas. 6. Roman society was organized as a pyramid of obligation, with the emperor as supreme patron. 7. Paul's admonition to unplug from the patronage system may seem a hopelessly utopian gesture, an impression reinforced by the fact that the closest parallels to Paul's expression medeni meden ophelit are found in comedy and on tombstones: the wish of a poor man, the praise of a virtuous wife. 8. And yet, it is clear that Paul intends for his admonition to be taken seriously. Paul himself refused a gift, and thereby declined an offer of patronage from a wealthy believer at Corinth, 1 Cor 9, 2 Cor 11:7, 11.9. How radical would Paul's admonition have seemed to his Roman readers? Even if some of the Roman assemblies met in tenements, insulae, rather than houses, domus, with patrons 10, they would not have been free of the obligations imposed by various forms of economic, legal, and social dependency in their daily lives. Second, the alternative to patronage is represented as a form of mutualism, owe no one anything, except to love one another, ei me to allelis agapan. The particles ei me designate an inclusive exception. A new and singular obligation is to replace social and economic dependency upon patrons. 11. The articular infinitive to agapan is totalizing, not discrete acts, but a whole way of life is enjoined upon believers, the anaphoric reference of the article indicating that the command was already well known. 12. Several scholars have recently and rightly argued that Paul advocated the practice of economic mutualism as a survival strategy among members of his messianic assemblies. 13. Moreover, the collection for the poor among the saints in Jerusalem, Rom 15:26, upon which Paul labored for many years, is best understood as an ecumenical extension of mutualism as an alternative to patronage. 14. The challenge for Paul, as the agent of mutualism, was that the group designated by the reciprocal pronoun allelis, one another, in Romans 13:8 was a diverse group, including slaves and free, Jews and Gentiles, women and men, poor and rich. 15. The practice of mutualism among the members of such a group would have entailed significant voluntary redistribution of resources. 16. At least this was the case at Corinth, where a few wealthy believers, such as Crispus and Gaius, 1 Cor 1:14, Rom 16:23, 17 had joined a congregation whose majority consisted of the poor, the uneducated, and the lowborn, 1 Cor 1:26, 28, 11:21, 22. 18. This was also the case in the partnership between the Corinthians, whose abundance Paul emphasizes, and the saints in Jerusalem, who suffered lack, 2 Cor 8:14. 19. In advocating mutualism, Paul revived the old Greek ideal of equality, isotes, and gave it a new theological basis in the self-impoverishment of Messiah Jesus, 2 Cor 8:9, 15.20. Paul's promotion of mutualism, like his injunction against patronage, seems wildly utopian. But, again, it is clear that Paul intended his admonition to be taken literally and applied practically. This is indicated, among other things, by Paul's recurrence to the language of obligation in the rationale that he provides for the contribution of the Macedonians and Achaeans to the poor in Jerusalem in Romans 15:27. Indeed, they owed it to them, kai ophelitai eisen auton, for if the Gentiles have partaken in their spiritual goods, they are obligated to render them services also in material things, ophelisen kai en toi sarkaikois lido urgise. 21. Once again, we may ask how radical Paul's advocacy of mutualism would have seemed to his Roman readers. Most of the Christian assemblies at Rome comprised slaves and the poor, as their location in the harbor district of Trastevere and in the damp and heavily trafficked valley of the Porta Capena suggests. 22. But more affluent Christians may have assembled in other districts, such as Marsfield and the Aventine, regions that show evidence of a Christian population at a later period. 23. Third, the object of love is described as the embodiment of difference, for the one who loves the other, hogar agapen ton heteron, has fulfilled the law. 13:8b. 24. Paul's choice of the term heteros, other, to designate the object of love is surprising. 25. The expected object of the verb agapeo is either brother or neighbor, given the citation of Leviticus 19 to which Paul's formulation looks forward. 26. In Leviticus 19:17, 18, the neighbor is your kinsperson, one of the sons of your people. 27. But in the term heteros a clear nuance of difference resides. 28. Embraced within this difference are differences in ethnicity, status, and gender that characterized the membership of Paul's messianic assemblies, Galen 3:28, cf 1 Cor 12:13. 29. The obligation of mutual love not only traverses these distinctions 30 but embraces the other as the embodiment of difference. Paul's choice of the word other, rather than neighbor or brother, was no doubt intended to short-circuit the widespread assumption in Greco-Roman society that true love depended upon sameness, affinity, and familiarity, and that the true friend was a mirror of the self. 31. The sweeping nature of Paul's formulation suggests that Paul had in mind not just particular cases, but the ethic of the community. A community that practices love of the other can never be a totality, that is, a group closed upon itself. A people that practices love of the other is perpetually incomplete. 32. Fourth, Paul asserts that love of the other accomplishes the law's original purpose, for the one who loves the other has fulfilled the law, nomen pepleromen. The nomos under consideration here is the best and highest law known to Paul, the Mosaic Torah, as demonstrated by the four commandments from Deuteronomy 5:17, 21 and Exodus 20:13, 17, LXX, cited in 13:9.33. The fact that the word nomos is used here without the article may suggest that Paul also wishes his readers to think of law in a generic sense. 34. In any case, the echo of the Jesus tradition in the verb pleru is crucial, as in Matthew 5:17, to fulfill the law is to penetrate to its root. 35. And, Paul asserts, we come closest to the original intent of the law in the one word that summarizes or recapitulates all the commandments: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. 13:9.36. These observations prepare us to address the final question: how does an awakening among those who have grasped the full import of the Messiah's death and resurrection make possible the execution of the command to love the neighbor? The signpost to the right path is found in the command itself: you shall love your neighbor as yourself, agapizais ton plision su ho sioten. All love is directed toward an object, even if that object is the self. 37. But the kind of love varies with the object. Libidinal love seeks the object of desire, spiritual love is evoked, or enforced, by the divine, even if God is conceived psychologically as the superego or the apex of the symbolic order. 38. The third love, love of neighbor, is the most difficult of the three, because it requires the highest degree of resolve. Rabbinic commentators on Leviticus 19:18 were already familiar with this distinction and saw it embodied in a peculiarity of the biblical text, where the Hebrew verb ahab, love, takes the preposition le, rendered to, for, on behalf of, for the sake of 39 love of a woman or love of God, by contrast, is denoted by ahab plus the object marker, nota accusativi, t.40 the immediacy of attraction that a man feels for a woman whom he sees on the other side of the road, or the rapture with which a person finds that he or she has been singing Kadosh, holy, 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 in a morning dream just before waking are not operative in the case of the neighbor. There is a gap that requires resolve, a motion of the will, a conscious choice, a gap denoted and covered by the preposition le. Although thinking and writing in Greek rather than Hebrew, Paul was familiar with the different kinds of love and the greater sacrifice required in order to love the neighbor. In a foundational text, Paul explains, "For while we were still weak, the Messiah died at the Kairos on behalf of the ungodly." Scarcely on behalf of a righteous person will someone die, though perhaps on behalf of a good person someone might dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love, agape, toward us, in that while we were still sinners the Messiah died for us. Rom 5:6, 8.41 Paul can imagine, with difficulty, cases where a righteous person or a good person might evoke love sufficient for a self-sacrificial act. But Paul is unable to speak of death for the weak, ungodly, and sinners without reference to the love of God. Taking this passage as the messianic foundation of the ethic enjoined in Romans 13, we may now draw an inference: one who has awakened to the messianic nature of his or her own existence is empowered to do the most difficult thing, the thing that Freud, as Paul's spiritual heir, rightly judged to be unreasonable and impossible in human terms, to love the neighbor. But we should bear in mind that, according to Paul, there is no unmediated access to the strength to love the neighbor. The passage to such an extraordinary love leads through messianic suffering, Rom 5:3, 5.42. If the commandment, in the context of Paul's messianic faith, furnishes an index to the means of its fulfillment, we have nevertheless discovered that the subject of the awakening is not the individual in isolation, however intense and genuine his experience may be, but the community of those who have been called, the ecclesia. Just as in Romans 13:11, 14, where the personal pronouns and the verbs of address are plural, so in 13:8 the imperative, ophelet, is plural and the pronoun, allelos, is a reciprocal plural. How, then, does a collective subject, awakened to its messianic life, put into practice the ethic of neighbor love? As a heuristic, we may compare Paul's idea of awakened communal consciousness with another vision of collective subjectivity that has inspired political action in the modern period, the Marxist idea of class consciousness. Here we must proceed cautiously, with due attention to historical circumstances, so that our comparison should not be superficial, but differential. Once again, we have Giorgio Agamben as predecessor, since he contemplates the comparability of the Pauline and the Marxian concepts of class in his discussion of the messianic vocation, klesis, in Romans 43. However, for us, the point of comparison is not the concept of class, but of class consciousness. We take it as established that classes existed in Paul's world, insofar as class is defined as an economic relation that separated one's mode of life, interests, and culture from those of other groups and placed them in opposition to one another. 44 But it is a legitimate question whether, and how far, class consciousness existed among the Sabelite in antiquity. 45 Of this there are only sporadic glimmerings, for example, the social revolution in the Achaean town of Dyme in 116 to 114 BC. 46. The slave revolt led by Spartacus in 73 to 71 BC. 47 The protest of the plebs of Rome against the mass execution of the slaves of Pedanius Secundus in 61 CE. 48 Perhaps we should also include the conspiracy at Sybera, on the border of Phrygia and Caria, in 23 CE, in connection with which 107 public slaves escaped from their condition. 49 These tremors of awakening were vigorously suppressed by the authorities, 2 of the leaders of the revolt at Dyme were immediately condemned to death by the proconsul, while another was sent to Rome for trial. 56,000 captured followers of Spartacus were crucified along the Appian Way from Capua to Rome. 51 Nero suppressed the riot of the plebs against the execution of 400 slaves of Petanius Secundus by lining the whole length of the road along which the condemned were marched to their deaths with detachments of soldiers. 52. The sources, produced almost entirely by the elite, are no doubt partly to blame for the paucity of evidence of class consciousness among the poor in antiquity. For example, our only evidence for the events in Dyme is an inscription recording a letter of the proconsul Q. Fabius Maximus to the city of Dyme, which complains bitterly of the cancellation of debts and of the enactment of legislation contrary to the constitutions granted to the Achaeans by the Romans. 53 A reference to the oligarchical governments imposed upon the cities of the Peloponnese by Lucius Mummius, after crushing the revolt of the Achaean League in 146 B.C. 54. Whatever limitations are imposed by the sources, it is clear that the constitution of sovereign power in Rome depended upon the maintenance of a system of distinctions between classes that was both symbolic and frighteningly real. 55 Citizens were distinguished from non-citizens, free from slaves. Certain persons were categorized as infames actors, prostitutes, gladiators. Thus, they did not enjoy inviolability of the body, and might be beaten or killed with impunity. 56 Seneca reports the diverse means of torture that he had seen masters use against their slaves. Some hang their victims with head toward the ground, some impale their private parts, others stretch out their arms on a fork-shaped gibbet. 57 In those places where the populace came together, the theater and the amphitheater, the segregation of seating reinforced stratification. 58 The Augustan Lex Julia Theatralis 59 A law renewed by Claudius and Nero 60 rigidly segregated spectators into different social groups, each with a pre-signed seating area, accessible via a specific entryway. 61 A hierarchical arrangement also adopted in civic arenas in Roman colonies. 62 The entertainment offered in the amphitheater, beast fights, executions of criminals, gladiatorial combats ritually reconstituted the order of power. 63 In all these ways, Roman authorities suppressed the development of an ideology that might bind elements of the populace together and sustain a program of action. 64 As is well known, the Marxist theorist of class consciousness, according to George Lukács, argued that class consciousness was unable to achieve complete clarity in antiquity because the various sectors of society remained unaware of the economic basis of the problems and conflicts with which they were afflicted. 65 Instead, individuals and groups assumed that their conflicts had a natural, legal, or religious basis, depending on the circumstances. 66 Economic, legal, and religious categories were so tightly interwoven as to be inseparable. 67 Hence, there was no possible position within such a society from which the economic basis of all social relations could be made conscious. 68 The surviving literature of the early empire validates Lukács' judgment. Wherever something like a liberating counter-ideology appears, consciousness is mediated by a divine agent. An instructive example is the life of Aesop, a genuine folkbook pervaded by an anti-Hellenic bias. Here the claims of the educated elite to have a monopoly on wisdom are subjected to vulgar and witty criticism. 69 Aesop is a mute, ugly, deformed slave, who, like other slaves, is beaten and tormented, and is powerless to retaliate. 70 The reversal of Aesop's fortunes is brought about not by resistance and revolt in concert with his fellow slaves. 71 But by the goddess Isis and her daughters the Muses. 72 As a reward for Aesop's kindness to a priestess of Isis who has strayed from the highway and become lost, Aesop is granted the power of speech and the ability to conceive and elaborate tales. 73 The priestess petitions Isis, O crown of the whole world, Isis of many names, have pity on this workman, who suffers and is pious, for the piety he has shown, not to me, O mistress, but to your appearance. And if you are unwilling to repay this man with a livelihood of many talents for what the other gods have taken from him, at least grant him the power of speech, for you have the power to bring back to light those things which have fallen into darkness. 74 The goddess subsequently appears to Aesop in a dream, and not only restores his voice, but asks each of her daughters, the 9 muses, to bestow on him something of her own talent. 2.75 The author's point in making Isis's miracle the inaugural event in the life is to assert the necessity of divine intervention in order to alleviate Aesop's plight. On this basis, the priestess of Isis makes her appeal: only with the help of the goddess can a poor workman, who labors under every disability, experience a liberated consciousness. Obviously, Paul's epistle to the Romans construes awakening as mediated by a divine agent, the Messiah. So we may stipulate that the collective subjectivity whose awakening Paul summons is not an instance of class consciousness, as the latter is defined by orthodox Marxism. 76 Nor is it clear, in any case, that the Pauline ecclesia was coextensive with a single class. 77 To be sure, the majority of believers in the communities founded by Paul were poor. Paul emphasizes the abysmal poverty, he kata bathos tokia, of the assemblies in Macedonia, 2 Cor 8:1, 2.78 Even in wealthy Corinth, the majority of those who responded to the calling of Messiah Jesus were poor, uneducated, powerless, lowborn, 1 Cor 126.79 Some, perhaps many, were slaves, 1 Cor 7:21, 12:13.80 Yet, Crispus and Gaius at Corinth were persons of more than modest surplus resources. 81 And Paul commends Phoebe of Cenchrea as the patroness of many, prostatus Polon, in Romans 16:1, 2.82 The formation of a community out of persons of different social classes would have necessitated a collective subjectivity that transcended class consciousness. Lukács judged a transcendence of immediate class interest for the sake of a totality to be impossible. No class can do that unless it is willing to abdicate its power freely. 83 Paul insists that precisely such an abdication of class interest is not only possible but necessary for a community that has grasped the full import of the event of the crucified Messiah. Agamben deserves credit for having called attention to a passage in Marx that appears to be a secularization of the Pauline idea of a community whose collective subjectivity transcends class. 84 In contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, Marx attributes a redemptive function to the proletariat as the agent of a collective universalism. Where, then, is the possibility of emancipation? Answer: in the formation of a class with radical chains, a class of civil society which is not a class of civil society, an estate which is the dissolution of all estates, a sphere which has a universal character by its universal suffering. A sphere, finally, which cannot emancipate itself without emancipating itself from all other spheres of society, which, in a word, is the complete loss of man, and hence can win itself only through the complete re-winning of man. This dissolution of society as a particular estate is the proletariat. 85. Agamben comments, the ecclesia permits more than just one analogy with the Marxian proletariat. Just as he who is called is crucified with the Messiah and dies to the old world, Rom 6:6, in order to be resuscitated to a new life, Rom 8:11, so too is the proletariat only able to liberate itself through autosuppression. The complete loss of man coincides with his complete redemption. 86. But if we now ask what conclusion Agamben draws from this analogy, with respect to Paul's understanding of collective subjectivity, we are disappointed. The problem is not that Agamben questions whether one can really speak of a classless society in Paul. 87 Agamben knows that class conditions are null and void of meaning for Paul, even if Paul advises believers that each should remain in the state in which he was called. 1 Cor 7:20.88 Circumcision is nothing, Paul insists, and uncircumcision is nothing. 1 Cor 7:19. Were you a slave when you were called? Paul asks. Never mind. For in the Lord, the one who was a slave when called is now a freedman of the Lord. 1 Cor 7:21, 22. Agamben knows that the Messiah has redeemed believers from every condition of existence. 1 Cor 7:23, embodying this insight in the paradoxical formula: the messianic vocation is the revocation of every vocation. 89. The problem is that Agamben's notion of the collective subjectivity to which Paul summons seems to be devoid of content, that is, of identity. The worldly vocations are never replaced by a new vocation. Agamben insists, the messianic vocation separates every klesis from itself, engendering a tension within itself, without ever providing it with some other identity. 90 According to Agamben, the Pauline ecclesia is a remnant produced by a division of divisions, not all that dwells in a zone of absolute indiscernibility between immanence and transcendence. 91 Agamben concludes, the messianic people is neither the all nor the part, neither the majority nor the minority. Instead, it is that which can never coincide with itself, as all or as part, that which infinitely remains or resists each division. This remnant is the figure, or the substantiality assumed by a people in a decisive moment, and as such is the only real political subject. 92. But of what sort of political action would Agamben's remnant be capable without a new identity, a new vocation? Perpetually in tension with itself, inhabiting a zone of indiscernibility between immanence and transcendence, the ecclesia, as Agamben conceives it, seems to dwell within its vocation as an exile, in dispossession. 93 The political ethics appropriate to such a remnant would seem to be non-possessive, kenotic waiting. 94 As a collectivity without identity, Agamben's ecclesia is a space hollowed out within the power structure. 95 A space of messianic anticipation and perhaps even conspiratorial resistance. But as a collective immanence that is not fully aware of itself, Agamben's ecclesia seems incapable of the tiger's leap of revolution. 96 One is tempted to characterize the spirit of passionate, messianic resignation that permeates Agamben's politics with Kafka's dictum, there is plenty of hope, an infinite amount of hope, but not for us. 97. In the end, the collective subjectivity to which Paul summons, and from which he demands the revolutionary practice of neighbor love in the form of economic mutualism, seems better understood by Alain Badiou, who insists that Paul was advocating a collective universalism. 98 In the face of the collapse of Leninism, the party of the proletariat, and the socialist state, Badiou calls for the eventual opening of a new sequence of the communist hypothesis, 99 which would consist in a revolution of the mind, 100 through the discovery of a point that stands outside the temporality of the dominant order and what Lacan once called the service of wealth. 101 Toward the renewal of a collective consciousness, Badiou offers, as an experiment, a declaration, there is only one world. 102 Badiou is fully aware that such an affirmation flies in the face of the evidence of capitalism's triumph all around us. Indeed, Badiou offers his affirmation as a deliberate counter to the false and empty universality of capitalism. 103 Which has achieved its sovereignty by configuring the world as a homogeneous market of subjected and territorialized selves, so that nothing might impede the circulation of capital. 104 Badiou's utopian declaration, there is only one world, is not an objective conclusion, it is performative, we are deciding that this is how it will be for us. 105 Badiou concludes, the political consequences of the axiom, there is only one world, will work to consolidate what is universal in identities. 106. Badiou's proposal has an uncanny similarity to the mature Paulinism of Romans 13:8, 14, both in its commitment to the collective well-being of others and in its insistence that such a political commitment is possible only for those who can connect to another temporality than that assigned to us by the dominant order. 107 Except that the collective subject that Paul seeks to awaken, and from whom he demands unconditional love, is not a universal subject, but a singular one, whose identity and ethics are determined by the Messiah. We the many are one body in the Messiah, hoi polloi hen soma esmen an Christo, Paul instructs believers, and according to one, members of one another, to decathes alilon meli, Rom 12:5.108 The singular subject who confers unity, identity, and mission upon the many is the crucified Messiah, the one who died for all, 2 Cor 5:14, for the weak, for the ungodly, Rom 5:6, 8, for the nothings and nobodies, 1 Cor 1:26, 28. Thus the communitarian particularisms, against which Beatty rails as impediments to a universal truth 109 are not erased in the Messiah, but embraced and affirmed. The one who loves the other as the very embodiment of difference, is the one who fulfills the law, Rom 13:8b, point 110. We may summarize. By the time that Paul wrote his last epistle, his eschatology had undergone significant development, I would suggest, intensification. Paul no longer speaks of the parousia, whether he still believed in a second coming may be irrelevant. In any case, Paul had come to stake all upon the possibility of an awakening. The awakening would occur when believers, who had been roused from the sleep imposed by the dominant order, grasped the full import of the messianic event for their present existence. This constellation is the now time that believers must discern. The awakened sons and daughters of God take full charge of their lives, casting aside the behaviors that have previously ensnared them. The awakened sons and daughters of God are the militants of the messianic event, capable of unplugging themselves from the patronage system and devoting themselves entirely to mutual love, expressed concretely in the practice of economic mutualism. In the broader context of Romans 12-15, Paul spells out the implications for life in the messianic community. Because the measure of communal identity and ethics is now the self-sacrificial love of Messiah Jesus, there is no longer any basis in law or custom for judging one another, Rom 14. Radical hospitality, welcome without conditions, is the law of the new life in the Messiah. Welcome one another, Paul concludes, as the Messiah welcomed you, for the glory of God, Rom 15:7, point 111. The awakening to which Paul summons is a revolution of the mind, to use the potent slogan of May 1968.112. If the political consequences of the awakening are the practice of economic mutualism and radical hospitality within the community of believers, then must we speak of a revolution without a revolt? Or of a revolution that is indistinguishable, in its long-term consequences, from revolt? 113. In any case, it should be evident that the ethical commitment demanded by Paul in Romans 13:8, 10, with its eschatological rationale in 13:11, 14, is incompatible with the acquiescence and obedience to governmental authorities preached in Romans 13:1, 7, as this passage has traditionally been interpreted. 114. Helmut Kuster once questioned if Rom 13:1, 7 is indeed Pauline and not a piece of Hellenistic Jewish parenesis interpolated at a later date. 115. The thought and vocabulary of Romans 13:1, 7 have more in common at key points with that of the Quisling Josephus than with the language of Paul's authentic epistles. 116. If this passage is an interpolation, it has had a disastrous result. The interpolator has successfully diverted the attention of generations of interpreters from the revolutionary ethics and intense eschatology of Romans 13:8, 14.117, and there is worse. Generations of the powerful have cashed the blank check that the interpolator wrote them by enjoining strict obedience to the governing authorities. 118. 7. Coda. Where does it stand today with Paul's summons to awakening? In my view, past eras instance several movements that are more than sporadic tremors of awakening. The monastic movement led by Francis of Assisi won the struggle for social justice led by Martin Luther King. 2. Yet, for several decades now, a profound sleep has descended over most of the world because of the triumph of global capitalism. In a discourse that Giorgio Agamben delivered in March 2009 in Notre Dame Cathedral in the presence of the Bishop of Paris and other high-ranking clerics, he charged the Church Catholic with having forgotten its messianic calling. 3. Agamben asks, will the Church finally grasp the historical occasion and recover its messianic vocation? For then, Agamben warned, if it does not, the risk is clear enough, it will be swept away by the disaster menacing every government and every institution on earth. 5. If I could name the danger that hangs over our present moment in late capitalism, it would be that the Judeo-Christian sense of social obligation embodied in the command to love your neighbor will be entirely obliterated by a resurgence of that structured inequality, with all its attendant cruelties, which was the basis of the political economy of the Roman Empire. 6. At this dark moment, more than ever, we should recall that, According to Paul, the awakening occurs punctually, at the moment when night has advanced to its furthest point, when especially deep darkness holds sway just before the dawn, Rom 13:12.